Padre Pio stopped at the threshold. He had not crossed it yet. He raised one hand, the hand bearing the stigmata, and stood motionless, his eyes moving across the empty air inside the open doorway, as though reading something written there in a language only he could see. Then he turned to Carmine and said quietly, without any theatrical emphasis, "3. There are 3 of them, and they have been here longer than your family has." Carmine had told him nothing. He hadn't described the house. He hadn't mentioned his daughter waking at 3 in the morning, pointing at the corner of her room, or why his son had become someone he no longer recognized, or the cold that came from nowhere in the kitchen every night at 10, or the rosary beads found broken on the floor with no explanation, or the crucifix that kept falling off the hallway wall despite a perfectly solid nail. He had traveled 5 hours from Potenza to San Giovanni Rotondo with a single sentence prepared: "Father, please help my family." He had not even mentioned a house. Padre Pio already knew, and what he revealed over the next 2 hours that April day in 1961 would explain everything. The breaking beads, the falling crucifix, the cold near the kitchen window, what 3-year-old Lucia saw when she pointed at corners and said, "Uomo." And it would reveal something even more unsettling. One of the 3 presences in the Martinelli home was not a stranger. It had a claim, a legal, spiritual claim, and it had been standing open for 39 years. Let me tell you something most people don't realize. Before I understood Padre Pio's teachings, I used to dismiss the idea of a house having spiritual history as superstitious nonsense. I was a nurse. I believed in what I could measure. That certainty cracked in 1987 when David and I moved into our house in Coventry. One room, the small bedroom at the back, always felt wrong. Not frightening, just heavy, as though the air had already been breathed completely by someone who had left nothing behind but the weight of their presence. I never mentioned it to David for years. I thought I was being foolish. I'm telling you about it now because by the time you've heard the Martinelli story, you may reconsider something in your own home you've been quietly dismissing. There is a question that many Catholic families carry in silence. They don't ask it at Mass. They don't bring it to confession because it feels too strange to articulate. It sits at the edge of prayer, half-formed, half afraid to be fully voiced. Why is there something in my home I cannot explain? Not a ghost, not anything from a horror film. Simply a heaviness in certain rooms that won't lift no matter how many times you clean or rearrange. A child who refuses to sleep in a particular bedroom without being able to say why. A family that was joyful 2 years ago that is now, without any single obvious cause, coming apart at the seams. Arguments that come from nowhere. A teenager who has changed in ways that feel less like adolescence and more like replacement. A rosary found broken. A crucifix that falls. A smell with no source. Most Catholics do one of 2 things when this happens. They explain it away scientifically because explanations are more comfortable than the alternative, or they become frightened and do nothing, which is the spiritual equivalent of watching a wound become infected and hoping it resolves on its own. What Padre Pio taught is that there is a 3rd response, an informed one, a practical one, a sacramental one. But it begins with understanding why. Because here is what Padre Pio insisted. You cannot address what is present in a home if you do not understand why it is there. And the why in the Martinelli case was not what anyone expected. Carmine thought the problem had started 14 months ago. Padre Pio would tell him it had started 39 years before Carmine was even born. Carmine Martinelli was 41 years old, an accountant in Potenza, a city built on a hillside in the mountains of Basilicata, a practicing Catholic of the steady, undramatic kind. Mass every Sunday, the rosary on Friday evenings with his wife Concetta. Not superstitious, not mystical. He believed in the church the way a man believes in the bones inside his body. not something he thought about constantly, but something that held everything together. His wife Concetta was 38. Their children were Silvio, 16, Rosa, 13, and little Lucia, not yet 4. The house was a solid stone building on the edge of the city, built in the 1890s. They had moved in 9 years earlier. A priest had done a simple blessing the day they moved in. Everything after that had been ordinary in the way ordinary families count as grace. Homework at the kitchen table, Sunday lunches, the children's arguments, the rosary on Fridays. Nothing that required explanation. The first strange thing happened in March of 1960. Rosa woke at 3 in the morning screaming. Not a nightmare scream. Concetta knew Rosa's nightmares well. This was different. Rosa was sitting up in bed, pointing at the northeast corner of her room, saying, "He's there. He's standing there. He's looking at me." Concetta turned on the light. Nothing visible in the corner. She held Rosa until the shaking stopped, left the bedside lamp burning, went back to bed and lay awake until dawn. It happened again 6 nights later, and again 4 nights after that. By May, Rosa had not slept through the night in 11 consecutive weeks. Then Silvio changed, gradually enough that Carmine and Concetta told each other it was adolescence. But adolescence doesn't arrive overnight, and it doesn't replace a gentle, studious boy with someone harder and colder who was prone to sudden rages, followed by long silences. His school marks collapsed. He stopped coming to morning mass. When Carmine pressed him, Silvio would look at him with an expression that did not feel native to the boy who had grown up in this house. Something borrowed, something that sat on his face without belonging there. Hold on, because what Padre Pio would say about Silvio in that room at San Giovanni Rotondo is something every parent with a changed child needs to hear. But first, the small things, because the small things were what finally convinced Carmine that the explanation lay somewhere beyond what he could see. The rosary that had hung on the kitchen wall since they moved in was found broken on the floor on a Tuesday morning in October of 1960. The hook was still in the wall. The nail was still in the hook. The string was broken in 2 distinct places, as though something had taken hold of both ends and snapped it. No child admitted to touching it. The kitchen had been empty. The crucifix in the hallway fell off the wall in November. Carmine replaced it, drove the nail deeper. It fell again in December. He replaced it again, used a larger nail with a locking hook. It fell a 3rd time in January. The nail was solid. The hook was solid. There was no structural reason for it to have moved. Each time it lay on the floor perfectly intact, as though it had simply been lifted off and set down. And there was the cold. Every night between 10 and midnight, in the kitchen directly in front of the window above the sink, the temperature dropped sharply enough that you could see your breath. Not from a draft. Carmine had resealed the window twice. The cold was not coming from the window. It was coming from the air itself, in a space approximately 1 meter wide, arriving at the same time each night and gone before morning. And then there was Lucia. 3-year-old Lucia, who had begun talking early and clearly, started pointing at corners of rooms. Not frightened, curious the way a child is curious about a cat on a windowsill. She would stop mid-play and point, adjusting the angle of her small finger as though tracking something specific. "Uomo," she would say. "Man." When Concetta asked what he looked like, Lucia considered the question with the seriousness of a child describing something real. "Old. He is sad." By the winter of 1961, Carmine had run out of explanations. He was an accountant from Potenza. He believed in demonstrable things, and he was watching his daughter refuse to sleep, his son become a stranger, his wife carry a fear she was trying to hide, and his youngest child point at corners and describe a sad old man that no one else could see. It was his mother, Nonna Assunta, who told him to go to Padre Pio. She had been to San Giovanni Rotondo twice in her life, had confessed to Padre Pio in 1947, and spoken of it for decades as the moment she finally understood what the sacrament actually was. She said, "Go, take a notebook, tell him nothing, he will tell you everything." Carmine arrived on a Thursday morning in April of 1961. He waited through Thursday, slept hardly at all, prayed through the night in the church. On Friday morning, after Padre Pio's Mass, he was directed to a small room where the priest briefly received visitors. He had planned to say nothing, as his mother instructed, but standing before Padre Pio, the 14 months of maintained composure broke without warning, and he heard himself say, "Father, something is wrong in my house." Padre Pio looked at him steadily, not the look of a man gathering information, the look of a man who has just had something confirmed. "Yes," he said, "I know." What he began describing left Carmine unable to speak. He described the kitchen with the sink on the right side as you entered from the hallway. He described the window above it. He described a spiral staircase, not common in houses of that construction, leading to the upper floor. He described the bedroom in the northeast corner. He described the cold that came at night near the kitchen window and disappeared before morning. Then he said, "There is a painting in the upstairs hallway, not a religious painting. What is in it?" "A painting." Yes, they had bought it at an antique market in Naples 3 years earlier. A landscape with mountains and a lake and dark pine trees. Concetta had liked the colors. Carmine described it. Padre Pio nodded slowly. "Where did it come from before the market?" Carmine didn't know. He had never asked. It had cost less than he expected. It had simply filled an empty wall. "Find out if you can," Padre Pio said. "But even if you cannot, you must remove it and burn it. What has been done in the presence of that painting over years cannot be separated from the painting itself." He paused, and then he said the words that pivoted the entire conversation. "The painting is not the largest problem. I need to ask you about your grandfather." Carmine's grandfather had been dead for 22 years. He had left, as far as Carmine knew, nothing unusual behind him. No dark chapter, no family secret, simply a dead grandfather who had built a small business and died in 1939 at 69. He had not thought about him in years. He was about to discover how wrong that comfortable assumption was. Padre Pio explained what he had seen with the directness that everyone who encountered him in serious spiritual matters described. He did not dramatize. He spoke the way a doctor speaks to a patient who needs to understand their diagnosis before they can accept the treatment. There were 3 spiritual presences in the Martinelli home. Each was different in nature and origin, but they were not unrelated. They had all arrived for the same underlying reason, and that reason was the deepest layer of the problem, the one that had to be addressed first. The first was what Padre Pio called an unresolved soul, not a demon, not a malevolent spirit in the strict theological sense, a human soul, a man who had died in that house in 1908 in a state of profound and deliberate spiritual unresolution. His name was Paolo Greco. He had owned the property for 20 years, a widower in his final decade, with a son named Aldo, who had moved to Naples and with whom Paolo had had a rupture so severe that they had not spoken for the last 7 years of his life. Paolo Greco died with a priest at his bedside who urged him to send for his son. Paolo refused. He died with that refusal as the final act of his will, a conscious, deliberate choosing not to release what he held. In Padre Pio's understanding, a death like that, at the end of which a soul deliberately refuses to let go, leaves a wound in the fabric of the space where it occurred. Not a trapped soul in the dramatic sense. Paolo had not been condemned, but his unresolved unforgiveness had left a heaviness in the location, a spiritual wound in the place, and spiritual heaviness Padre Pio explained, does not simply press down, it attracts. It was that attraction that had drawn the second presence. I've seen it with my own eyes, what a single object can do to the atmosphere of a home. As a health visitor for 11 years after leaving the hospital, I entered hundreds of homes across Coventry. There were homes where you felt peace from the moment you walked in, not because they were wealthy or beautiful, but because something in the air had been set right. And there were other homes, clean homes sometimes, even beautiful ones, where something was wrong in a way that had nothing to do with the people living there. I used to tell myself I was sensing family tension. I know better now. The painting in the Martinelli hallway had passed, before the antique market, through the hands of a woman in Naples who had used it repeatedly as a focal point in occult practice. The type of spiritismo common in southern Italian folk culture, not dramatic Satanism, but consistent, deliberate use of certain objects as points of contact with what she believed lay on the other side. Objects used repeatedly in this way acquire what Padre Pio described as a residue, not an intelligence of their own, but an open frequency. A door that has been forced open so many times the lock no longer catches. The connection had not been severed when the painting changed hands. It traveled with the object to the antique market, and from there to the Martinelli upstairs hallway in 1958, where it found the existing wound of Paolo Greco's death, and settled into it the way a secondary infection settles into a wound that has not been properly cleaned. This was why the strange events had escalated after 1958 and not before. For 46 years, the faith of the families who had lived there, their prayers, their masses, their blessings, had been sufficient to keep the wound from being used. The painting changed that. It provided an active entry point, but Padre Pio said that neither Paolo Greco's wound nor the residue in the painting was the largest problem. The largest problem was the third presence, and the third presence had a name, the ancestral claim of Benedetto Martinelli. Carmine's grandfather had been a carpenter and small contractor in Potenza. In the autumn of 1921, a failed speculative investment left him facing debts he could not repay and the genuine possibility of criminal proceedings. He was a family man, watching everything he had built be destroyed in 3 months. In that desperation, he went to a woman known locally for what was called, with the soft vocabulary people use for things they don't want to name directly, practical assistance. She was not thought of as a dramatic figure. She offered methods of influence that went beyond the ordinary, and she required a dedication in payment. Benedetto had dedicated, using the specific phrase she required, what was most precious to him. He believed this meant his tools, his workshop, his business. He may have half known it meant more. In the tradition from which her practices drew, the phrase meant his lineage, his family line, the ongoing spiritual inheritance of his blood. The business was saved. The debts were restructured in ways Benedetto never fully understood. He lived the rest of his life as a practicing Catholic who went to Mass and said his prayers and carried a small, managed guilt about that winter of 1922 that he never brought to a confessor. He died in 1939 and took the story with him. But a dedication made in the spiritual order does not expire when the person who made it dies. It transfers. It follows the bloodline, the way a lien on property follows the property through every change of ownership. The spiritual authority over the Martinelli family line had been offered formally and verbally to something that was not God, and that offer had been accepted. It had been standing as a legal claim in the spiritual order for 39 years. The wound of Paolo Greco's death had provided the initial opening in the location. The painting had provided an active second entry point, but the ancestral claim of Benedetto Martinelli had provided the foundation beneath everything, the reason why this family in this house had become the convergence point of 3 separate presences. The claim had given them an invitation. Carmine sat in the small room at San Giovanni Rotondo and felt the floor shift beneath him. He had come to report 14 months of strange events. He was leaving with the knowledge that those events had their roots in a decision made before his father was born, made by a desperate man who had died carrying it quietly, and who had unknowingly passed it forward to a son, who was now sitting here in 1961 with ink stains on his fingers and a notebook on his knee, learning what his grandfather had done to his family. Then Padre Pio said something that shifted the entire frame. Your grandfather did not fully know what he was doing. That matters. His ignorance does not dissolve the claim. The spiritual order does not operate on whether you understood the full implications of your words, but it means what he did was desperation and foolishness, not deliberate malice against the light. And God's mercy reaches further into ignorance than many people believe. He looked at Carmine directly. The claim can be ended, and you are the one who must end it. Padre Pio gave Carmine 6 instructions, not suggestions. Instructions, delivered with the specificity that characterized everything he taught about the practical spiritual life, because he understood that vague piety produces vague results, and the spiritual order, like the physical order, responds to precise and deliberate action. The first, remove the painting and burn it. Outside, on open ground, in the evening, not in haste. Before lighting the fire, speak a prayer of renunciation aloud, a direct address to whatever had been contacted through the painting, naming what was happening, withdrawing the welcome its presence in the home had constituted, declaring the closure of what had been opened. Padre Pio gave Carmine the exact words. Carmine wrote them in the notebook. The second, have a mass offered for the soul of Paolo Greco, by name by a priest who held that name consciously during the mass, praying specifically for a man who had died in 1908 in that house carrying unforgiveness. The mass offered for a specific soul, Padre Pio said, can accomplish in a single act of prayer what decades of the soul's own suffering may not yet have resolved. The third, and the most important, the renunciation of the ancestral claim. Carmine was to stand in the main sitting room of the house with the whole family present. He was to speak aloud, not think, not pray silently, but speak with voice and breath, naming his grandfather by full name, naming what Benedetto had done without euphemism, declaring that no claim originating in that dedication had any ongoing validity over his family, any of his descendants, or his home, declaring the family consecrated to Jesus Christ, and naming Mary as their mother and protector. Padre Pio was emphatic on one point: this must be spoken. Words carry weight in the spiritual order in a way that thought alone does not. Benedetto's words of dedication had been spoken aloud, formally, deliberately. The renunciation required the same formality, a matching deliberateness, because spiritual authority over a family line is established in acts of the will expressed in words. The fourth, a full house blessing by the parish priest, the complete rite of blessing for a dwelling, not the brief sprinkling. He wrote a note for the parish priest explaining why the full rite was appropriate. The whole family was to be present. Each family member was to hold a lighted candle. The fifth, a blessed crucifix carried personally by each family member to their own room, each one standing at their threshold with both hands on the crucifix, speaking, "This home belongs to Jesus Christ. This room belongs to Jesus Christ." Including Lucia, who was to be guided through the words by her mother, her small hands placed over Concetta's on the crucifix, her 3-year-old voice repeating what Concetta said. Because the authority of a family over their home includes the children, because a spiritual consecration made by the actual inhabitants, each one in their own voice, is more complete than one made on their behalf. The sixth, 30 days of the family rosary, all of them together, every evening at 8 o'clock, without exception, not as a spiritual weapon primarily, though Padre Pio taught that dimension as well, as an act of unity. What the three presences had damaged was not only individual family members. They had damaged the spiritual coherence of the family as a unit. The deliberate, daily, unified act of prayer rebuilds what spiritual pressure dismantles. You cannot bless the walls of a house and leave the family inside it fractured. The house and the family are the same spiritual reality. Carmine asked the question that had been sitting behind everything he had heard. Father, if we do all of this, is it finished? Will it be gone? Padre Pio looked at him with the directness that left no room for comfortable ambiguity. The presences will have no legal right to remain. They will have no claim. But a door that has been closed can be opened again if the family gives it cause. Whether those doors stay closed depends on your family, not on them, on your family. Carmine returned to Potenza on a Saturday evening. He prayed Sunday. On Sunday night, he told Concetta everything. He had expected fear or resistance, the practical exhaustion of a woman who had been managing a frightened household for 14 months and did not need new layers of complexity. What he found instead was relief, profound, physical, immediate relief. Concetta had known throughout the 14 months that the explanation was not natural. She had been praying for someone to confirm what she already suspected. And now there was not only confirmation, but a map, 6 specific steps, a direction. On Monday evening, Carmine took the painting down from the upstairs hallway. He carried it outside to the small courtyard. He built a fire in the iron basket they used for garden waste. He waited until the evening had settled into dark, as instructed. Concetta stood beside him. He opened the notebook to the prayer Padre Pio had given him and read it aloud, clearly, facing the painting propped against the basket. He named what was happening. He withdrew the welcome. He declared the door closed. His voice was steady in a way he had not anticipated. He placed the painting in the fire. It burned in the normal way of burning things. Orange flame, the normal smoke of canvas and old wood. And then, for approximately 3 seconds, the flame turned blue. Not the thin, transparent blue of a gas flame, a deep, saturated blue. Neither Carmine nor Concetta could explain it. Neither of them mentioned it to anyone outside the family for many years, not out of shame, but because they understood it was not their story to distribute freely. A confirmation given to the people who needed it, not as theater for those who didn't. Then the flame returned to orange, and the painting burned to ash, and the courtyard was quiet. That was the first night that Rosa slept without waking. She didn't know about the painting or the fire. She simply slept. She told Concetta at breakfast that she hadn't dreamed at all, which was unusual for her. The room had felt different, she said. She used the word lighter. 2 days later, the parish priest came. He read Padre Pio's note in the kitchen with his reading glasses on, and when he finished, he sat quietly for a moment. Then he said, "I know the full right. I have not used it in many years. I should have used it more." He returned the following evening with what he needed. The whole family gathered in the sitting room. Before the blessing began, Carmine stood in the center of the room. Concetta at his right, Silvio against the far wall, arms at his sides, attentive. Rosa beside her mother, little Lucia in Concetta's arms. Carmine had prepared notes. When the moment came, he did not look at them. He said his grandfather's name, Benedetto Martinelli. He named what Benedetto had done as specifically as he could. He did not soften it. He named it for what it was, a formal dedication made with words, of something that was not his to offer, to something that had no right to receive it. He renounced it in his own name, and in the name of Concetta, and in the names of Silvio, and Rosa, and Lucia, and every Martinelli who would come after them. He declared that no claim from that dedication had any validity over his family from this moment. He declared his household consecrated to Jesus Christ. He declared Mary their mother and protector. He was not a man who cried easily. He cried. The priest performed the full rite room by room. Then came the crucifixes. Carmine to his own room, both hands on the cross. This home belongs to Jesus Christ. This room belongs to Jesus Christ. Concetta to hers. Silvio, alone without prompting, to his own room, saying the words in a voice that carried something Carmine had not heard from his son in months. Rosa, solemn, to her northeast corner room, and Concetta guiding Lucia, the small hands placed over the larger ones on the crucifix, the 3-year-old voice repeating, "This home belongs to Jesus Christ. This room belongs to Jesus Christ." With the grave seriousness of a small child performing an important task, which is a gravity that adults rarely equal. The cold in the kitchen was gone that night. Not fading. Gone. Carmine stood in the spot for several minutes before he trusted what he was feeling. 2 weeks into the 30 days of family rosary, something happened that Carmine had not anticipated and could not have arranged. Something that came from entirely outside the family and that would confirm what Padre Pio had told him in a way that removed any remaining doubt. An elderly woman named Signora Carmela Rizzo, who lived 2 streets away, knocked on the door on a Wednesday morning. Concetta answered. The woman was in her mid-80s, moving carefully with a cane. She apologized for coming unannounced. She had heard through the neighborhood that the Martinellis had recently had their house properly blessed. She had been wanting to come for some time, she said, but hadn't found the right moment. She had known Paolo Greco. She had been a young woman when he died in 1908, living in the neighborhood. She described him as a man who had become harder after his wife died, a widower whose rift with his son Aldo was known in the area. She had been present in the house on the day Paolo Greco died. She had been there when the priest urged him to write to his son. She had heard Paolo refuse. She had watched the priest's face receive that refusal. She had never forgotten it. It had troubled her conscience for 50 years, she said, because she had not advocated more strongly for reconciliation. She had been 20 years old and had not known how to insist against a dying man's will. She had been praying for Paolo Greco over the years, she said, but not consistently, not with the intentionality the situation had required. She had heard that prayers were being said for the house and for those who had lived in it. She asked if she could add hers. Concetta stood at the door of the house that had been blessed 3 days earlier and thought of what Carmine had told her, that a mass was being offered for Paolo Greco by name. She said, "Yes, please come in." They prayed together in the sitting room, the young woman and the very old one, for the soul of Paolo Greco, who had died in 1908 refusing forgiveness, and for whom the living had now, 53 years later, finally begun to pray. That evening, Carmine wrote in his notebook, in the space beside the prayer of renunciation, "We could not have known Paolo Greco's name. Padre Pio knew. We could not have known his story. Signora Rizzo confirmed it. God leaves no detail unattended." Now, I want to tell you what happened to the Martinelli family in the weeks that followed, because this is where the story shifts from being about what was present to being about what changed. Silvio changed first. Within 2 weeks of the renunciation and the house blessing, his rages stopped. Not reduced, stopped. He became quiet in the way he had been quiet before the previous year, a productive quietness, rather than the shuttered silence of someone closed off from themselves. During the 3rd week of the 30 days of Rosary, he returned to daily Mass without being asked. He told Concetta he had been thinking about his grandfather's bargain and what it meant for him personally, for Silvio, as the continuation of that line, and that he wanted his faith to be something he chose rather than something he had simply inherited without ever fully owning. He went to confession that week. He told Concetta only that he had confessed things he should have confessed months ago. Rosa slept through the night, from the evening of the burning onward. Within a month, she had stopped referring to the corner of her room. By September, when school resumed, she had processed the experience the way children process difficult things, when the source of the difficulty has been genuinely removed, completely without residue, the way a wound heals when it has been properly cleaned. Lucia stopped pointing at corners within 4 days of the house blessing. She simply stopped. Whatever she had been seeing was no longer there to see. The cold in the kitchen never returned. 3 months after the events of spring 1961, Carmine wrote in his notebook, "I understand now that the house did not become ours when we moved in. It became ours when we took responsibility for its history." His grandson found that sentence in 2014 and included it in a small memoir about the family. "I have thought about it many times since I first read it, because it contains everything Padre Pio understood about spiritual authority in the physical world that most Catholics in his time and ours have not fully grasped. A home is not a neutral space. It carries the weight of every significant act of the will that has occurred within it. Every prayer lifted from its walls, and every oath spoken in anger. Every death that occurred there, resolved or unresolved. Every object that arrived carrying something the new owners knew nothing about. The family that lives in a home does not inherit only the physical structure. They inherit everything, and they have the right and the responsibility to address what they inherit." Here is the paradox that Padre Pio's vision of the Martinelli home reveals, and it is the most important thing in this entire story. The 3 presences that converged on that house did not come to destroy the Martinelli family. They had gathered because this family at this time had the specific sacramental resources to address 3 spiritual realities that had been unresolved for decades. The suffering was not arbitrary. Paolo Greco needed a mass. Benedetto's claim needed a renunciation. The painting's connection needed to be formally severed, and the Martinelli family was the family through whom, if they were willing to act, all 3 of those things could finally be done. They were not victims of their home's history. They became, through the choices they made in response to what Padre Pio showed them, the agents of their home's healing. That is a different story than the one Carmine thought he was living when he arrived at San Giovanni Rotondo. If something in the Martinelli story has resonated with something in your own experience, here is what Padre Pio's teaching makes available to you. The first is the full rite of house blessing, the complete rite in the Roman ritual, not the brief sprinkling of holy water that typically constitutes a home blessing. Every Catholic priest has the authority to perform it. You have the right to request it. Ask your parish priest specifically for the full blessing of a dwelling with the whole family present, room by room, with intent. Some priests are more familiar with it than others. Persist if you need to. The rite exists and its effects are real. The second is prayer for any souls who may have died in your home or on the land beneath it, in a state of unresolution. You may not know their names. You do not need to. You can pray, "Lord, for any soul who died in this place carrying something they could not release, receive them now into your mercy." If you can have a Mass offered with this intention, do it. The third, and the one Padre Pio considered foundational in the Martinelli case, pray a prayer of renunciation on behalf of your family line. Stand in the center of your home. Speak aloud. "In the name of Jesus Christ, I renounce any dedication, agreement, or offering made by anyone in my family line to anything that is not God, whether made in ignorance or desperation or deliberate choice. I declare that no claim arising from any such act has any validity over me, my family, or my home. I consecrate this family and this household to Jesus Christ, now and in all generations, and I ask Mary to stand between us and everything that has been given access to us through the choices of those who came before. Speak it aloud. Stand when you say it. The words matter. The fourth is the family rosary. Not as spiritual combat in the dramatic sense, though Padre Pio taught that dimension as well, but as an act of daily, deliberate, unified presence together in prayer. If there are fractures in your family, distances that have stretched too long, silences that have hardened into something that feels permanent, 30 days of the Rosary prayed together without exception addresses those fractures at the level where the sacramental life actually operates. And the fifth is this: do not carry what you have heard today as fear. Padre Pio carried the knowledge of these realities every day of his priesthood. He was not a fearful man. He was the most peaceful man who ever frightened a demon. He carried this knowledge the way a doctor carries the knowledge of disease, not in terror, but in the calm confidence that the disease has a treatment, that the treatment is specific and tested, and that it works. What the Martinelli family experienced was real. What Padre Pio provided in response to it was equally real. And what is available to you through the church he loved and served until the last morning of his life is the same. You have just spent this time inside a story about what was made right, about a grandfather who made a desperate bargain in ignorance in 1922, and about his grandson who dissolved it in a single afternoon in 1961, standing in the center of his sitting room with his children watching. About a man who died in 1908 refusing to forgive, for whose soul no one had specifically prayed in 50 years, and about an old woman named Carmela Rizzo, who had been carrying that unfinished prayer for half a century and finally found the context in which to place it. In the last hour, you have seen that spiritual presences in a home are not random, that ancestral acts carry forward and can be addressed, that the Church provides specific, effective, sacramental tools for these situations, not emergency measures for extreme cases, but the ordinary equipment of Catholic family life, which Padre Pio believed was being dangerously underused. That a family's deliberate daily prayer actively rebuilds what spiritual pressure dismantles. These truths need to keep reaching the families who need them. There is a super thanks button below this video, and I want to be honest about what it means. It is not paying for content. It is a way of saying these truths need to keep moving. There are families watching right now who are where the Martinellis were in 1960, frightened and confused, and reaching for an explanation that will actually meet the dimension of what they are experiencing. Your support is what makes it possible to reach them. You are not just a viewer. You are part of what keeps Padre Pio's practical, specific, sacramental wisdom available to people who need it most. Before I leave you, I want to ask you something. Has there ever been a room in your home, or in a home you lived in before, that felt heavier than the others? Not frightening necessarily, just different, harder to settle in. A room you always left sooner than you intended. I have asked this question to dozens of people in my prayer group in Coventry over the years, and I have never once been met with silence. Everyone knows exactly which room they mean. They have simply been waiting for someone to ask in a way that took the question seriously. Tell me about it in the comments below. And tell me whether your home has ever been properly blessed. The full blessing, not the brief one. And whether anything changed. I read every comment and I answer when I can. Write protected below this video if you have had your home blessed and felt a difference. We need to hear each other's stories. Padre Pio's wisdom has always traveled through testimony, and testimony requires someone to speak first.